Andrew, thank you so much for joining me in this Mind Body Solution special series in collaboration with the Mind at Large project. Super stoked to have you on the show today. How are you feeling?
No, I'm feeling great, Tevin. I've been looking forward to this and appreciate all your good work and happy to be continuing this conversation about the Mind at Large project, which is something we're really excited about, actually. So, but I know we'll get into that when you're ready.
Oh, well, on that note, let's just dive right in. For those who are new to your work, Andrew, what is Mind at Large and both the concept and the project? And how does process philosophy open up space for a mind at large view of reality?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, the Mind at Large label, that framing, comes from Huxley and even Bergson, right? This notion of a mind that is not simply restricted to finite minds like yours and mine, but a mind that could be all inclusive in some way, a mind that could be cosmic. The Mind at Large project is a playful expansion of that label into a 3-year academic conference series. And this is an endeavor that the Center for Process Studies, where I work, is partnering with the University of Exeter, Peter Hughes, who you spoke with recently, Matthew Segal of the California Institute for Integral Studies, Ellie Vintiadis of the American University of Greece, and several others are collaborating to bring together a host of different thinkers to essentially retell the story of mind, its omission from our conceptual landscape in the modern world, and now, I think, its exciting return in various forms. So the Mind at Large project names a 3-year conference series in which we're going to be exploring essentially the nature and character of mind from the finite firings of actuality at the base of the quantum world through the ecological environment of which we're all a part, and even up to the cosmic ecology, the whole cosmological landscape that we are so much a part of. And so you brought in, process philosophy. So the founding team members, as you've discussed with them a bit, is certainly informed by Whitehead's thought, informed by process philosophy. And I'll just say as an aside, I'm in love with Whitehead's thinking. I'll just admit to having an intellectual crush on his expansive vision. And Whitehead is a thinker that pointed to the need for something like mind, feeling, interiority. He wouldn't say consciousness per se, that comes later, but of course that's a point we can work out. But mind is being fundamental in the sense that there's no situation in which mind is fully omitted from the world. We find ourselves as an expression of the world rather than an exception to it. And he emphasized a deep continuity. So at least part of what this conference series will do is explore the range of different perspectives in what's called panpsychism, or from the process tradition, panexperientialism. So Whitehead's thinking, his process thinking, is a way of naming the way in which the very process of reality is a process of experience building upon experience. And the dawning of contemplative heights found in consciousness much later in the evolutionary scale. But for him, for a number of others, panpsychism is a way of expressing a deep continuity and also deep meaning, right? Our connection to this universe and not our disconnection from it. So Whitehead's thought will inform the Mind at Large project. It'll not be confined to Whitehead's thought by any means. So we anticipate bringing in luminous thinkers from around the world who were working across panpsychism, working across various forms of idealism we see blooming out there. And we'll have some countervailing voices too, who are, skeptical of the extent of mind. But we want to regenerate the story about mind's return after the fall of a more classical materialistic perspective. And I just hope, everyone will stay in touch who's listening. We're very happy to have you, Tevin, and Mind Body Solutions on board. It'll be great to meet you in person. So, that's a snapshot of what's coming up over the next 3 years. And I'll just say April 15th to the 17th is our date for the first conference at the University of Exeter. And if folks go to mindatlargeproject.com, we'll be trying to keep that updated with all who's coming and different ways to get involved. So that's a broad overview of what we're up to.
I think it's a great way to open up. You've covered so much in that, and I'm looking forward to it as well. And I can't wait to meet all you guys in person. And this is going to be an exciting project. It's super stacked. There's so much to discuss. Let's get straight into it. You've argued that materialism or a physicalist view of the world is too restrictive to explain consciousness and value. So let's start off by discussing what alternatives does process thought then offer us, and why is it a good alternative?
Yeah, excellent. Right. So, I mean, it's no secret that, the mind-body problem, right, as we frame it, is really a problem faced for a particular metaphysical perspective. Um, that perspective, Whitehead called it, scientific materialism. And this is the notion, the 17th, 16th, 17th century notion of matter as being a vacuous actuality. So it's something that essentially in its nature and character is immobile, it's dead, it's inert, it's only externally related. And he essentially says, if that's what the world is made of, and you are made of that, then we face a problem as to how we are conscious, experiencing, and above all, valuing creatures. So I think, this is a perennial question. It's a long-standing question for the history of philosophy. And I think where Whitehead begins, where the process tradition begins, is by stating that we're anthropocosmic expressions of the nature and character of things. And I sort of hinted at this earlier, that what that means is that our experience, the internal feeling, the qualia, the sensations of value, of meaning that are present to consciousness are not just sort of epiphenomenal byproducts. Our experience actually for Whitehead is the closest clue we have to what the nature and character of things is like. So at one sense, that commits us to some form of pan-experientialism or panpsychism. And the distinctions there is that process thinkers generally don't say consciousness extends all the way down in nature, but that experience extends all the way down, a mode of prehension, as Whitehead called it. So it's not apprehension or comprehension, right? The sense of a conscious grasping of things, but it nevertheless is a mode of experiential feeling that goes all the way down and presumably all the way up, right? We wouldn't want to necessarily say that it pinnacles in the human being. It has, the volume is turned up in an extraordinary way in us, but there could be expressions of it far beyond us. And maybe we'll get to that. So, but having said that, it's not, panpsychism or panexperientialism in the process tradition is not just a result of, strategic philosophizing from an armchair. We're a part of nature, therefore mind has to be a part of nature. So it involves that. There's a certain logical, continuity we're faced with in being minds in nature. But Whitehead too, in the process tradition, the mind at large group are very much involved in the scientific world as well. So one thing we saw is that the death of materialism with the quantum revolution opened up new spaces for seeing mind as fundamental, seeing energy. I mean, what is energy? This ability to do, this process, this becoming. And for Whitehead, it's an abstraction from a more fundamental becoming of events. And these events for him, again, are not events of nothing. They're events of something. They're events of experience and even a mode of intrinsic value. So, I mean, my work leverages all of that, or tries to, in different ways, not only at the level of finite minds, but also discussions of ultimacy where mind and value come together in very significant ways. And just as a reminder to everyone, any introduction to philosophy class someone takes, all the philosophers you essentially study that are part of a basic intro to philosophy, they all held that mind and or value had a place of ultimacy in the nature of things. There's many contours, many nuances involved there, but I think that's important to emphasize because people often forget that. We just think mind is a byproduct of purely physical processes. The only problem is we've not in the least solved how that can actually happen, right? There's the problem. How, if the universe is dead, mindless, valueless, where and how do we see the emergence of mind, value, and consciousness? We haven't solved that issue. And so this has caused a lot of people, process thinkers, others, to say that these are a part of the ontological primitives out of which the universe is made. It's living, it's animate, it's minded, and it's striving after possibilities of worth. There's a lot we can add to that, but I'll pause so you can jump on in.
You've touched on so many things that I've got prepared to ask you about, that I'm prepared to ask you about, but let's take it step by step. When we look at Whitehead's cosmology, how does it connect with the Mind at Large project's aim of exploring consciousness across scales, from quantum physics to ecosystems to the cosmos? Perhaps let's go through that, because I think one of the great features of your work is the way you explain quite complex concepts in a very easy to digest manner. And I think that's why I'm looking forward to this episode. For anyone who watched the first one, which was with Peter and Matt, I think you'll be able to sort of give us a slight bit more clarity on some of the concepts? Because there were a few comments when you read about it, because it's fundamentally a difficult thing for a typical materialist thinker to grasp. And more often than not, if there's zero training in philosophy, it's just deemed crazy. Let's just be honest. It sounds ridiculous. But if someone can explain it to them a little better, I think it goes a long way. And that's precisely what the aim of this project is. So, yeah, how does Whitehead's cosmology then connect us with this project in greater detail?
Yeah, sure. Well, and you mentioned, the difficulty, the language. Not everybody is reading this philosophy. So it's important for philosophers to not just assume that everyone knows what they're talking about. This is our besetting sin, by the way. we do this all the time. I mentioned Whitehead writing at the turn of, in light of the advance of a lot of different sciences. So he was attuned particularly to science, in the form of physics, evolutionary biology, psychology, physiology. He's quite keen on science being essential to the philosophical endeavor. In other words, it offers an element of data that we cannot ignore, right? And there's an overall theme here I think we don't want to miss between science and philosophy. It's like these are different disciplines, right? But they offer each other something. So, the sin of the philosopher is that, they just sit in their armchair, right? They're disconnected from the data and just think lofty thoughts. So I think the value that science offers to philosophy is to keep them rooted to the data. But by the same token, if science, and there's figures out here today who always do this, deGrasse Tyson or Yuval Noah Harari, who actively sort of disparage philosophy as if it's not needed, or Hawking's comment, right? Philosophy is dead. And it's silliness as far as I'm concerned. But the value of philosophy to science is to point out those unspoken presuppositions. In fact, one of the statements that Peter brought up in part was that Whitehead makes about scientists, and this is from his Harvard lectures. He says, every scientist to preserve his reputation has to say he dislikes metaphysics. What he really means is he dislikes his metaphysics being questioned. So the point of all that is to say both the empirical data and the probing of the abstractions and the assumptions of that data is where philosophy and science can come together. And if we go back to this notion that we're not separate from the universe, this again, I think, offers us or affords us a place to start. So mind belongs to nature, as long as we are a part of nature. And this again is something that was overlooked, I think, many times in different philosophical views in the modern period, that we've been bifurcated or somehow abstracted. It's a methodology that's important. But again, if a methodology becomes a metaphysics, if we forget to reintegrate ourselves as part and parcel of nature, as exemplifications rather than exceptions to its nature, then mind will remain anomalous to us. So I think Whitehead reminds us through a radical empiricism, following James, that mentality experience is a product of nature. It's as natural as trees, rivers, and rain. And so we begin with that and say that even from our experience, we have no experience of vacuous dead matter. Our whole experiential encounter is filtered through consciousness. And so he reasons upward and downward based upon our fact of continuity with nature. And for him, again, and people can probe this, you never find a state where mind is irrelevant. In fact, the whole reason mind is there is to allow for novelty to enter the universe, such that if there were no minds, the universe would endlessly repeat itself. So again, let me wrap it up by just saying it's a process ontology because process is fundamental for him. Becoming. It's the verb-like nature of reality takes primacy over the noun-like nature of reality. But what is verbing, if you want, is experiential states, not just vacuous dead stuff. And so when you reason that forward, when you reason it backward, you find that mind is primary in some sense, and that evolution is essentially evolving out of the functioning of mentality. So does that help a little bit? I mean, we can add more.
I think, Andrew, something important as well for anyone who has not read Whitehead's work and who don't know who he is, I think they should also know that he was a mathematician, and that lots of people forget about this because his philosophy has grown so much at this point that they forget that this man, Bertrand Russell, the way they were working on things in the Principia Mathematica, the type of work he did in his earlier life versus the work he did later on was very different. But he has the background. to sort of back it all
That's
up
right.
at the end. Once he finally ties all these things together, he sort of wraps it around into this unique philosophy that today you can see is clearly on the rise. Anything you want to add about that?
No, I think you're right about that. So yeah, the first, his life is generally broken up into three scholarly periods, but you're right. This mathematical phase is absolutely primary for him initially, working with Russell on Principia Mathematica, moving into larger questions of the philosophy of science, physics, philosophy of education. He has great work on education. And then later in life, when he comes to Harvard, 1924, developing a systematic orientation towards the nature of things, a metaphysics or speculative philosophy. So it's a kind of culmination of his work starting, in the British speaking world and over to America. But absolutely, again, not just an armchair philosopher, but somebody deeply entrenched in the sciences, and open to all modalities of human experience. So this is, again, one of his big critiques of a scientific perspective, which omits to take adequate account of human experience. We have the empirical experience, but what about aesthetic experiences? What about moral experiences? What about, God forbid, religious modes of experience? So these are all elements of data he thought that have to come into the metaphysical quest. And his philosophy is, philosophy of organisms, trying to account for that range of experience in a way that's coherent, adequate, and applicable.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I think, one of the things, we discussed process philosophy in great detail. The other thing is with these mathematics, he then develops a relational ontology using it. It goes very deep. And with that, in mind, value, and cosmos, you develop a relational ultimacy. Could you explain how value itself may be fundamental to reality?
Good. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, how much time do you have? No. Well, so as far back as we go, again, to Plato, but if we move up through Plotinus to Aristotle to, Aquinas, Leibniz, all these different, value has been a part of the philosophical tradition. But it's not been obvious that it stands on its own, and it's not unproblematic, right? So my work in Mind, Value, and Cosmos is really an exploration of the notion of ultimacy conceived in terms of mind and or value. So I speak about the Western philosophical tradition in many ways being the axio-noetic tradition, right? Axio meaning value or worth, and noetic or noetikos meaning mind. So this is a tradition wherein mind and value have had this primary kind of place. And so the reason I fell in love with value, and I have to credit Robert Kuhn on this too, because he and I have been in discussions through John Leslie's work and the notion that value can be a reason for being. And we might define value as just a confrontation with states of intrinsic worth, right? States that are worthy in and of themselves. And we think of notions like truth or beauty or goodness as instantiations or modalities of kind of value states. And so the reason I'm interested in value is because I think value is one of those kinds of things that can provide a kind of ultimate explanation if one is interested in those. Now, admittedly, that's a more classical sort of interest metaphysically, and I'm okay to be interested in that. But value is some of those things where explanation stops, right? If something is good, right, you've offered a reason for its being that doesn't require any further sort of reasoning. And so in Mind, Value, and Cosmos, which is a really fun book, I changed some things about it, looking back. I tried to present a case for ultimacy that wasn't based in one thing or reality as ultimate, nor even many of them, but actually the way in which multiple domains of ultimacy require each other. So I playfully spoke of the relational nature of ultimacy, or ultimacy as relationality. So here's where it gets fun, though, because if one's willing to say that value is not simply projected on the universe, but is announced to our experience in some way, then we face all sorts of problems. Like, how can there be standards of value, possibilities of value in the nature of things? Do they just, float in some metaphysical void? Would we want to say that? And this is where mind comes in, right? Because in our own experience, since we're expressions of the universe, our only access to the possible and possibilities of value is through our mental apparatus, is through our contemplation, through our evaluation. But we know that there's possibilities that transcend us. For example, our own actuality is an actualization of possibilities that transcended us. We didn't prefigure our own possibilities. So it's the womb of nature, in other words, holds infinite potencies. And not just vacuous possibilities. I'd say there's no such thing. There's possibilities of forms of order, forms of value, forms of truth, beauty, and goodness, to use the standard terms. And so what that book tried to do is bring together mind, value, and the cosmos and their entanglement as the expression of what is ultimate. So relationality is ultimate. What mind gives to value, value gives to mind. And what God gives to the world gives to God. So that it's not one thing that's ultimate. It's looking at an entangled whole and naming that relationality. Whitehead called it mutual immanence, right? The way in which there's a reciprocity among domains of ultimacy, even hypothetically at the level of divinity. But that takes it to a region where some folks are a bit unfamiliar or suspect.
Yeah, you mentioned there's a few things you change in the book. If you were to rewrite it today, what are those things and why?
Yeah, great. Well, so I mentioned this language of mutual immanence, right? And one way I'll express that relationship when it comes to like mind and value from the largest possible perspective is that it's not obvious that value can do anything, right? If you just see value abstracted, it's an abstract standard or an ethical requirement, as John Leslie puts it. So in this sense, value seems to require the actuality of mind, something concrete in and through which it can be realized or enacted on the world, right? Think of the divine mind. So Leslie has argued that, God's existence is reasoned by divine value, that value eternally procures the existence of God and the world. But it's hard to imagine value by itself doing that. It's like saying, 2 + 2 itself, 2 + 2 equaling 4, that abstract truth by itself put $4 in your pocket. Whereas we want to say an agent or an actuality did that. So mutual immanence names the way in which mind requires value and value requires mind, both of them together, that relationship, giving us a deeper insight into ultimacy. But I wonder about that now a bit, right? So you asked about what I'd change. Part of what I've appreciated of Ian McGilchrist's work is this notion of asymmetry in relations. So there can be things that are equally necessary but unequally related in some way, right? And I think at the level of value, this is quite important. So like good and evil could be inextricably related in a certain sense, but asymmetrically related in the sense that good can include evil without diminishing itself, but the reverse cannot be said of evil and good, right? So if I went back, I'd probably take the notion of asymmetry a bit more seriously and think I didn't really touch on it there, but there's time for another book there. You could also include a host of other thinkers. So I use John Leslie, Keith Ward, Whitehead to think through these questions of ultimacy, and I might expand that to include various other voices.
Yeah, I think Ian McGilchrist's work's very enlightening. Highly recommended reading for anyone. I've had him on the show, and he's such an excellent speaker. He can really illuminate concepts in a way that's quite rare at this point. But you just mentioned something that follows up on exactly my next question: the axiological asymmetry that you discussed. How does this approach? How does it help us approach the why there is nothing rather than something mystery that the Mind at Large project confronts?
Very good. Well, you said why there's nothing rather than something. I was
Sorry,
say,
why there's something rather than
you want to
nothing.
reverse that? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean,
great.
both
Well,
questions would be quite fascinating.
So some might argue there is nothing, right? Just a comment on McGilchrist. He's a good friend of mine and good friend of ours. I was just with him in Aspen, and a wonderful man doing some great work. How does it help us think of why there's anything? Because again, think of how if the foundations of being were said to be evil, say, it would be rather hard to account for the prevalence of good. Right? If there were a sort of demonic drive, as it were, towards chaos and destruction, it's hard to imagine why a world such as ours would ever emerge. Because at least on Whitehead's account, order is a fundamental conviction. You have to have an order before you have a world. It's not as if you have a world that exhibits any random order. He says, we have a world because we have a more fundamental order, and that order is aesthetic. Right? So at the very least, there's aesthetic value at the foundations of how there's a world. But back to the evil good thing for a moment. So if the foundations of being are in some sense evil, it's hard to explain how there could be so much good. But I think the reverse is not necessarily the case, right? And this is that asymmetry. So good and evil, if we want to use those terms, require each other, but they're unequally related in the sense that goodness can include evil without being diminished. Whereas if evil includes good, it's extinguished, right? And I think this is so important. So this allows us at one avenue, I'm not saying the mind at large group would agree with this. Peter and I have our, arguments about value. But if goodness is at the foundation of being, it can include evil within itself. So, it's as if it fulfills itself in doing so, right? Or love and hate, right? There's something about the tanglement of these values. They require each other. Love and hate seem to be related at one level, but love fulfills itself by including its opposite. Hate destroys itself by including its opposite. And so if we're trying to make sense of a world where there's hate and a world where there's evil, right? I don't think it's the right solution is to locate those at the ground of it all. I think a certain richness of value can be the reason for their being, even if there are instances of their opposites which take precedence. Again, that's arguably you could bring that back to Plato's idea that the good is that which procures being, but is itself beyond being. And then that evolves through Aristotle, through Plotinus, and through the whole Western Christian, largely tradition. I even think you find it in Whitehead, right, who says, in some sense, God's existence is founded on value, and that God's nature is limited by goodness, right? So here's a interesting claim that to be good is to not be evil in some way. It's to be limited at an ultimate sort of axiological level. Now, again, that's speaking of God. It'd be different when we think about us. We're a whole complicated mix of these value domains, I think.
Yeah, I think you brought this up now by bringing up Peter. You guys have some differences in thought, and that should be the case, and that's exactly the point of these discussions, because we've got many panelists who have certain views, drawing a lot on panpsychism, idealism. You mentioned that we'll try and get other people who have alternate views so that we can have some good discussions. But I think at this point it would be great to highlight some differences that you might have with some of the other panelists. Peter, Matt, anything in particular you could discuss with us where you guys differ, where your views might align or diverge, because I think that's the great way for people watching or listening to realize that this isn't just a group of guys getting together to try and sell you some sort of because that's always at the back of someone's mind. What are these guys trying to sell? I mean, what's going on? Let's try and show people that there are differences, very big ones perhaps sometimes, but ultimately it all leads to us trying to do one thing specifically, and that is question metaphysics, all metaphysics. And that's just the primary goal here, I think, ultimately.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Right. We're not just trying to get you to drink our particular flavor of metaphysical Kool-Aid. Right. So we really want a critical, rational, and a committed endeavor to think through these different ways in which mind is returning. When mind returns, but value also returns in some way. So again, I would say that where there's mind, there is the announcement of value as well. Like, again, Max Scheler, right, the German phenomenologist, and again, Ian McGilchrist bringing this up a lot. Value announces itself to consciousness. It announces itself to experience. Whitehead says that the primary glimmerings of consciousness reveal something that matters. It says, have a care. Here is something that matters, right? So the mattering of things, not simply matter. The world is made of meaning as opposed to simply vacuous matter. Now, the Mind at Large team, again, we share a lot of affinities and love for Whitehead's thought, for process thinking, for German idealism, and for a lot of these different perspectives. But yeah, we have our nuances of difference. So I think the biggest one between Peter and I would be this whole question of value and axiology. So he has a Nietzschean interpretation of Whitehead, which I've critiqued a little bit in a recent article in Process Studies on whether or not Whitehead's God is good. But at a more general philosophical level, I'm still trying to figure out what his claim of value is. So he claims to be a relativist in some way. Now, relativity of value, I'm quite fine with, right? People disagree all the time about what is good, what is bad, what is ugly, what is not. But that there's a difference between them is an assumption we inevitably bring to our experience and to the data. So I don't think it's possible to be a moral or an axiological relativist. I think value is a metaphysical question, and I think Peter has all the scaffolding to include value in a robust sense, but he's still too hesitant in my perspective. But that's an ongoing discussion. Now, Matt and I share a lot in common. I'd say Matt is not as value centric as I am, although he's more value centric than Peter. I think Matt has more of a spiritual and religious inclination. Peter less so. And I think I'm probably aligned with Matt on that, if not a bit more so on the spiritual and kind of religious side, although I think Matt is a great religious and spiritual thinker as well. None of that is required. People don't be interested in that to come and enjoy these conferences, to hear from potentially Christoph Koch or Bernardo Kastrup or Philip Goff, colleagues of ours who are, again, offering mind-centric, mind-primary proposals. It just so happens that value is also a part of this conversation. And if one's willing to admit the reality of value and its possibility as, in some sense, transcending our actualization, then that becomes a natural place to look for as to why there's anything. Now, Whitehead doesn't think there was a time when there's nothing, right? He didn't ask the question of Heidegger or Leibniz, right? So between something and nothing, there's becoming, right? Existence is activity ever moving into the future. So as far as he's concerned, there was not a time when, nothing was the reigning default. So we don't ask the question, how do we get from nothing to something? That's problematic. That's the ontological question. For him, it's the cosmological question. So it's not Heidegger or Leibniz, it's Aristotle and Plato. It's the emergence of a certain dominant order that is aesthetic in nature, right? So again, order being deeper than the world itself, order being an aesthetic reality, and the world itself emerging from layers of aesthetic order upon aesthetic order, at a very high level of which Whitehead thinks is the dawning of moral intuition, the dawning of moral value. So, and this is the point Peter and I argue about too. Aesthetic value is the widest and deepest form of value. And some want to say Whitehead's simply reducing moral value to aesthetic value. I don't think so. I think he's locating moral value across a continuum of evolutionary experience, a continuum of evolutionary value. Electrons can't be moral or immoral, but they're instantiations of aesthetic harmony, right? Moral dawning, moral consciousness emerges later when we can actively discriminate past, present, and future, and in the way in which our actions further the progress of the world in some way. So again, we don't all agree. And, as you can imagine, when we have our pints, we have a lot of fun just discussing these issues.
Yeah, no.
But they're wonderful guys. I love them. They're wonderful philosophers.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to one of those discussions when we get together, because all those names you mentioned, Christoph Koch, Bernardo Castro, Philip Goff, I mean, I've had all of them on the show. Ian McGilchrist. Yeah. You spoke about Robert, he's such a kind guy. If you send him an email with a lengthy paper you need him to read, go through, he's one of those people who reply instantly. But there's one of those people from that whole list we just mentioned there, who I wish I could interview one more time, and I probably will in the future, and most likely even part of this project, is Ian McGilchrist, because when I chatted to him it was many years ago at this point. At the time, my knowledge of this was quite very superficial. I still think it is quite superficial compared to many of you guys. But there's so many questions I know that I would ask him now that would be so much more fruitful to the discussion. And that's the beauty of projects like this, is it's an opportunity for us to explore this even further and sort of get down into the nitty-gritty. You just briefly touched on the atheistic worth. Let's touch on that a bit more. So you write about panentheism and then its atheistic worth. How does panentheism advance the mind at large discussion of God, cosmos, and thereafter we'll take it to consciousness as well?
Awesome. Yeah. Well, wonderful question. And just again, a comment on McGilchrist. We hope to get him involved actively in this project. If not in person, then certainly online. But I agree. His thought is just amazing. And he draws quite a bit on the process tradition, not just Whitehead, but many others. But he's a deep appreciator of Whitehead. And of course, Heraclitus as the ancient founder of process thinking. So panentheism, or its close cousin pantheism, right? And one of the big debates out there today is how to demarcate these positions. It's tough to do. There's a lot of nuances at play. But both theism, pantheism, panentheism, there's other forms of theism are definitely a part of this mind at large project. When we begin to elevate or rise the status of mind to its highest kind of level, as it were, its highest altitude. So these are ways of framing the God-world relationship. And the notion of anatheism comes from Richard Kearney. Anatheism, all that means, ana, the prefix, and theism is the returning to God. And Richard Kearney has a great book called Returning to God After God. And anatheism is his way of expressing that. So panentheism, I think, is a fruitful theological model, a fruitful anatheistic model, to the extent that it's offering a way to reconceive the reality of God in the world in a way that doesn't arguably have the deficiencies of theism on the one hand and pantheism on the other. So at least as traditionally understood, pantheism means all or everything is God, whereas theism means simply God as distinct from or in no need of the world. So at the etymological level, panentheism tries to hold on to the respective strengths of both these positions, the absolute immanence of pantheism, the transcendence of theism, in a way in which the world is internal to God and God is internal to the world. So at a popular spiritual level, and I have a book series on this called How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere, people are beginning to be more attracted to panentheistic conceptions precisely because it allows for a deeper way of returning to God after God. Right? God is dead, Nietzsche says. Yes, but the death of one God doesn't mean all conceptions of God has died. Right? Atheism, this is the value of atheism, right? It's a ridding of those idolatrous forms that are obviously false. But atheism is not the next best solution once one discussion of God has died, right? Because there's as many conceptions of God as there are, forms of atheism, So I just think panentheism emerges as a way of integrating immanence and transcendence in the science-religion discussion. It's become very important in the discussion of theodicy and the problem of evil. It's become an important discussion. And even in discussions of religious pluralism and interreligious dialogue, panentheism becomes a model that's anatheistic. It allows people to avoid the difficulties of other more arguably extreme positions. It's a mediating sort of position. But again, these require nuances because folks have to define things in relation to other positions, and pantheism itself is not all that simple. Peter just wrote a great article on it, nor is theism all that simple. So we have to be careful about caricaturing these positions and offering new models.
Yeah, one of the distinctive themes in your work is exolife or astrobiology. And if life exists beyond Earth, how does that expand the mind at large vision of consciousness in the cosmos?
Wonderful question. Yeah, exotheology, exophilosophy. This is a really energetic field right now. There's a lot of really cool work being done in it. Where I like to begin is to say that we are, or let's assume that there's at least one other mental perspective elsewhere in the universe. If we assume the truth of that for the moment, then we are extraterrestrial life, right? We are ET on this planet, and we're an example of the kind of dimensions that are embodied in extraterrestrial life. So again, what I would say in the context of the process tradition is that mind or experience is a part of the ingredients of evolution, right? It's a part of the ontology. Again, because let's remember, vacuous dead matter dissolved. The Newtonian Cartesian conception of matter dissolved into something much more fluid. By hypothesis, the fluidity of that energy is mental processes, is mental experience, at least for Whitehead. So at one level, if mind is in the ontology, then there's absolutely mind beyond Earth, right? In some sense, evolution, the advancing rise of evolution is turning the volume up on mentality. And not just that, but those qualities that come along with mentality, the capacity for realizing value, for enjoying value, the ability to entertain, to evaluate the possible. So in some sense, I think the universe is about the evolution of mind. And we haven't figured out the relationship between mind and life, right? I am rather keen to say that just as there's a hard problem of mind, there's a hard problem of life, and that these are in many ways related to each other. my thinking at this point is to say that mind and life are sort of mutual expressions of each other in some way, right? So that where there is mind, there is also an attendant form of life, in a sort of biopsychic ontology. That's Evan Thompson's term, right? Where life and mind co-arise together. And so, assuming that's in the ontology, then we should expect that where conditions are ripe, there are infinitudes of other minds. We know this about our own planet in some sense. Michael Levin speaks about the mind blindness, right, of modern culture, of modern philosophy. We should expect there to be infinitudes, I'd say, of other populated worlds. And that's not by any means a stretch of the imagination. It's like, we need to stretch it beyond that. We need not be the only minds, nor the highest pinnacle of mind. Mind is not just a human thing, right? We have a particular expression of mind and life in human beings, in Homo sapiens. But these categories, these possibilities preceded us. They're deep. And their range of expression elsewhere is perhaps beyond our imagination to conceive. Now, where that connects, so that's all exophilosophy in some way, reasoning about the status of mind, value in life beyond Earth. I have an upcoming volume on exo-axiology, which again is taking that value discussion beyond Earth, right? All the debates we have about value theory here can in principle be extended beyond as well. And the last thing I'll say is exotheology or astrotheology is a very interesting field as well. This is the theological side of my thought. We've always wondered about whether or not the divine reality procures one world or many. And so what would it mean, internal to religious traditions or not, whether God, as it were, seeks out many worlds? Plenitude, Augustine called it, right? Multiplicity, Whitehead called it. So all of that comes into play in this whole exo discussion. I have another book or two in me on the topic. Eventually, I'll try to get to it. But it's very, very exciting. It's the cosmological dimension of all this.
Touching on that cosmological notion, what role do you see psychedelics or extraordinary states of consciousness playing a role in testing or even inspiring process cosmology? Do they hint at dimensions of mind at large?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have as much experience with psychedelics as Matt or Peter, right? So I have a somewhat of a distance from it. Although, the more I hang around Peter, that might change. God bless him.
Let's, Andrea, just to also just adjust that question a little. It's more about psychedelic or extraordinary states of experience. So this could be any form of extraordinary conscious states, whether religious, flow states, high on LSD, any of them.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I just think, again, to go back to when we're experiencing, it's not just, we're not just internal to our own subjective experience. In a sense, we are. But what Whitehead says again is that what you're experiencing there is a clue about the way in which nature is, the way in which it works. So the fact that we can have these extraordinary experiences, again, as you say, mediated by, substances or randomness of mysticism or flow states, John Vervaeke, another friend of ours, doing good work in that regard. All of these are clues about the deeper depth of mind that is behind, if you want, normal waking states. So, and here I think it's worthwhile to bring up Whitehead's big critique of epistemology in modern philosophy. So he critiqued, Russell and Hume, even Kant to some extent, for assuming that our dominant mode of perception is through the senses. What we hear, what we see, what we taste, our sensory modalities. And it's no wonder that a lot of things get, sort of ignored if the only way of knowing and perceiving the world is through our senses. So Whitehead critiques that and say it's the wrong side up. He wants to invert it and say that there's a deeper mode of causal relatedness. He calls it causal efficacy. It's experiential, but it's non-conscious, right? And he gives examples of it. So he says, for example, when Hume says that we see with our eyes, isn't he assuming a whole causal efficacy of our body's relatedness, right, through the viscera of our eyes such that we can see? Because when you see, you don't see your eyes, you see with them, right? When you taste, you don't taste your tongue. I hope not, right? You taste with it. So what this suggests for Whitehead is that there's a whole inheritance below the conscious level, right? If we think of conscious waking experience through our senses as the tip of the iceberg, there's a base, there's a depth that the iceberg, there's also a part of the iceberg. And so what this means is that there's far more experiential possibilities than simply conscious sense perception allows for, right? What else is in that world below the iceberg? Infinitudes of platonic-like forms, other entities or beings, the reality of God in some way. And is it the case that sometimes those realities that we're related to in a non-conscious way sometimes rise to consciousness? Is that what a religious experience is? So Whitehead says we've started from the wrong side up. Not all experience is sensory experience. Just a moment ago, right? We inherit our moment as continuous with this moment now. Memory is not a mode of perceiving through our senses, right? It's another sense of non-sensory perception. So all that comes into play. I think that's one of the most important contributions Whitehead makes. It's there in his book, Symbolism. It's meaning and effect. It's small but very powerful. It's there in process and reality. But that experience happens first at a non-sensory level. And through the miraculous nature of our body, it's channeled into the cohesiveness, the clarity of our sense perceptions. Whitehead calls the body a complex amplifier, right? So it turns the volume up of these more primal feelings into the clarity of our sense perceptions. But we make a mistake if we think that those waking sense perceptions are all there is, right? And I think what helps us show that that's a mistake are these forms of exceptional experience, whether psychedelics, near-death experience, mystical forms of experience, or what have you. There's a deeper story that can be told of mind and our relatedness to mind, consciousness and unconsciousness. I mean, these are interplaying, and we didn't just need the modern, psychoanalysis to tell us that. So,
yeah, I think in line with these different states of experience or consciousness, let's talk about AI and artificial consciousness. Could a process relational framework provide better tools than behaviorist benchmarks for evaluating machine consciousness?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And again, thinking about your discussion with Matt and Peter, Peter seems a bit more open, right, to AI taking on a conscious form. Matt less so. I think I side with more Matt on this, although we have to qualify and say, in an ontology where experience is fundamental, we can't categorically rule out that machines will become conscious in some way. I follow McGilchrist in this too, right? He says what we're dealing with is artificial information processing, not artificial intelligence, right? It's one thing to simulate, intelligence in these machines, but others would say we're not simulating, we're simply trying to emulate it. These distinctions are very important because, again, the AI discussion, as wonderful and profound as it is, raising all sorts of questions, if we're not careful, we will return back to a more mechanical-like framework, right? And the reality is that the vast things in the universe are not machines, but organic in nature. They're prehensive. Again, the feeling tones of relatedness that is fundamental to Whitehead's universe. So I think process thinking, more work needs to be done. Frankly, not a lot of work has been done in terms of process metaphysics and AI. I remain skeptical that we can leverage a pan-experientialist or panpsychist ontology into the reality of real conscious machines. I mean, how do I know your consciousness? You're conscious. We still face the problem of other minds. This is not really going away. We face it with our biological companions, right? I think it remains in terms of machines as well. So I feel I have some tension in my spirit about it. I'll put it that way. And more work needs to be done. But I'm rather skeptical of the pseudo-religious nature of the quest for, thinking machines.
Yeah.
Or at least conscious machines, right?
Yeah. Okay, so if you had to consider conscious as not a brain-bound entity, but rather relational, how should we think about things like ecology and planetary mind in relation to the current issues that we have going on with our climate and planets?
Yeah, great. It's certainly the case that one of the metaphysical dimensions that has exacerbated the ecological crisis has been this notion that nature is, at its fundamental level, dead, vacuous, inert. Um, as Bacon can be summarized, right? We can master and control her, right, for her secrets. So this is a portrait of nature that is instrumentally valuable, but not intrinsically valuable. So again, to get back to some of our earlier conversation, I think that where there is mind, there is also value. And again, to bring up Whitehead, value pervades nature in some sense because experience pervades nature. Right. So where there is experience, there are states of value presented, appreciated by that form of experience. Now, he would say that even at the fundamental level of ontology, we don't have to go that low, even though I would argue that that's plausible. But when you think about a plant life or other animals, right, you can't just cut into them and find mechanical parts, as Descartes suggested, right? This is somewhat anathema, but it really makes a difference how you understand status of mind and value with respect to the ecological situation. So I think this is part of the reason Whitehead's thought process thinking has been at the foundations of eco-theology on the one hand. So John Cobb wrote a wonderful book, Is It Too Late? A Theology of Ecology, 1972 or 3. This started the whole eco-theological movement. Around the same time, Whitehead's thought was being adopted at a philosophical level in environmental philosophy as well. So, this notion that experience, sentience, value are part and parcel of one another and are in some sense pervasive of nature has tremendous repercussions for how we treat nature. We cannot see nature as simply something that is instrumentally valuable. We're obligated to treat intrinsic value in the way that it requires. That's what we require of ourselves. And again, we're not separate from nature, right? So you're experiencing, valuing expressions of, extraordinary order and harmony that doesn't pop out of nowhere, right? There's no magic in metaphysics. Whitehead's not for magic in metaphysics. With James, with Bergson, there's a deep continuity that extends behind and below us. And if that's the case, we're in a world of mindedness, and minds deserve certain obligations when it comes to treatment at a moral level. So all that's being rethought now. Of course, there's debates between deep ecologists and process thinkers about, whether everything is equally valuable in the same way, or whether there's hierarchies or gradations of value, which then impact our treatment and what is owed to other species. But if you're to take that even higher, because you asked about planetary forms of consciousness, we were just in Exeter for a plasma cosmology conference, suggested by a number of people there that plasma may exhibit a form of life and intelligence that's non-organic, that's non-biological in a sense, but nevertheless sentient. Is the sun conscious, right, as Rupert Sheldrake has argued? Michael Levin has suggested this. Attila Grand-Pierre, others in the process tradition. Or, as Whitehead said, perhaps the nebular sentient entities, right? So just how wide are we willing to imaginatively conceive the extent of mind, life, and sentience? I think in the kind of framework that we're discussing here, we have to be careful, but I think imagination has to be a part of it. And we don't know. We don't know, but the idea that it stops with us or emerges randomly from a dead universe previously is totally incoherent in my perspective.
You've touched on this indirectly and directly in many ways, but I think it's great for me to still ask you. The problem of evil is central to your work, your theological work, let's say. But how would you express how this view of yours helps us to reframe things like suffering, meaning, and value in new, fruitful ways?
Yeah. So there's a sort of theological and just more the philosophical side of that discussion. I mean, at one level, suffering is not something that is purely the domain of human beings, right? Again, it sounds ridiculous to say this, but this was not the general perspective that animals could suffer, right? So in one sense, we face the problem of where there are minds, right? There could potentially also be modes of suffering too. I don't want to, anthropomorphize too much. Again, trying to avoid that because, again, I think mind is not just a human concept for Whitehead. So again, anthropocosmic versus anthropocentric. These distinctions are very, very important. Creatures can suffer, perhaps not like us, right? Can amoebas suffer? I'm not sure. They have some sort of emotional satisfaction, but it's not like ours by any means. But the idea that suffering goes all the way down, I'd have to think about that a bit further. That would only exacerbate the theodicy question, right? In some way. So, but at a basic level, we are compelled to take suffering serious. Simply beyond us, right? We see ecosystems suffer, right? This is a form of collective suffering. We don't know if there's an awareness of that suffering per se, right? A tree is not actively aware per se, like we are. It doesn't have the kind of unified coordination that would allow for experience like us, but we know there's damage that can be caused. We know that species can go extinct. We know that there's a form of suffering, perhaps indirectly, that can be recognized. But why, if the foundations of being are good? Right? This is to bring back the theological discussion. Whitehead is a voracious critic, with Nietzsche, with a lot of the masters of suspicion over this notion of a barbaric divine power. And Hartshorne named it well in his last book, Omnipotence is a Theological Mistake. So part of the problem of theodicy is to reconcile how divine power and divine goodness can be reconciled. The process tradition thinks we've misunderstood divine power as coercive, as impositional in some way. Rather, it reconceives it based on persuasion and based on possibilities. So the only way in which God can bring a world into being for process theology is through the provision of the possible, the offering of what is possible, right? It's like the best of yourself being offered to you, Tevin, at each moment, right? But you are the one that has to actualize it, right? So in some sense, the reality of suffering is a byproduct of a co-creative universe where God offers the possible by means of persuasion, and the world accepts or deviates from that possibility. Now, I don't know about you, but a possibility has never pushed me over as such, right? Possibilities are received into our experience as lures, as persuasive coaxes towards certain modes of definiteness, modes of value. They're persuasive ways in which evolution is brought from chaos into cosmos. So process thought doesn't affirm divine omnipotence. Evil is a reality. It's a shadow side of an evolutionary cosmos. And we think we can affirm that and not lose the conviction that at the foundations of being, there is still goodness, right? Again, because we face the problem of how a world such as ours comes into being, right? The world is ripe with tragedy, but also triumph. Axiology, also atrocity, right? All these things come together in a process conception. So I'll just stop there, but I think theodicy remains an interest of mine at a theological level. For some, it's enough to say there is no divine reality, but there's deeper conversations to be had about all that. And it's not as if God doesn't exist, the world is unproblematic. The world's always problematic. You know?
If I'm just thinking about a 17-year-old me, first year med school, coming out of school, high school, thinking about how I love science, mathematics, and I don't think I would ever be able to have conversations like these with philosophers, theologians. I think it's something I was so closed off to at that time in my life. When you come out of this New Age atheist movement, you're almost antagonistic and anti-theism or anti-discussions about it. And I just look back thinking, like, if I had to tell me back then, I'd be having conversations like this, I would probably not believe that to be the case. And it takes me to the next question, which is, many scientists are skeptical of metaphysics. And this project is aimed to try and get us, not us, well, at this point, I'm very much a supporter of what we're doing. I love this cause. And it sort of shows over the years of how I've transitioned in my own thought, my own philosophy and appreciation for the broader knowledge that you guys are sharing and that everyone we're bringing on board is going to share. They remain skeptical still. Why do you think this is fundamentally, Andrew? And how can this project and what we're doing now try and change that?
You're absolutely right that many scientists, although not all, right, I have to qualify that, remain very skeptical of metaphysics. And I mean, to be clear, many philosophers remain skeptical of metaphysics, right? So there's all sorts of reasons metaphysics can be dismissed. we have to be careful about what we mean by that. So, I mean, maybe I'll just lay out a couple reasons philosophers and scientists tend to dismiss metaphysics. So one would be sort of following the Kantian line that, well, whatever metaphysics deals with things beyond all possible experience. Of course, the problem is, if that's what metaphysics is, who cares, right? I mean, really, who cares? If it's detached from experience, we can't ever bridge that gap between experience and beyond experience. I mean, how does that help us? So if a scientist thinks that that's what metaphysics is, it has no connection to empirical data. And philosophers would also, be suspect. Another sort of caveat of that kind of critique is that it deals with some dimensions of experience, but neglects others, right? So again, Hume, Descartes, others really had a disembodied view of what the human being was, right? They discounted the causal efficacy of our bodily relations to the wider environment, and therefore, offered a sort of half-truth with respect to their metaphysical understanding. Others have just critiqued metaphysics for essentially being about mastering and controlling nature, right? There's a sort of Heideggerian critique that could come in, right? That we thrust concepts onto the world and then through technological means sort of master and control her. Metaphysics people think is about absolute certainty, right? We all have friends who like to make these kinds of statements, right? And in brighter moments, we might make them ourselves, but that's not what metaphysics is about for Whitehead, nor does it start with the clarity of first principles. So again, all that is to say that we need to know what we're talking about when we use the language of metaphysics. What it meant previously is connected, but not necessarily, it's not confined to that. So for Whitehead, metaphysics, it can be expressed in the method of an airplane flight. It's a beautiful metaphor. He says, you start on the ground of particular observation, you make a flight into the thin air of imaginative generalization, and then you land again to the ground to analyze through rational kinds of means. So that's the method of philosophy for him. That's the method of metaphysics. You start with experience, you're on the ground, you generalize that experience imaginatively to different altitudes, longitudes of the flight, and then you return to the ground to rationally test again what the ground offers. So scientists may be, pretending they don't need metaphysics, and maybe they don't need it to the extent that it's been interpreted or dismissed in the ways that I mentioned. But for Whitehead, again, it's a part of the scientific endeavor, right? And I'll be careful. Every great scientist has known this, right? They've known in some sense that science and philosophy require each other. They're companions. The thing is, Whitehead would add theology as offering data too. So, he has this great statement where he says, it's a mistake for science to dismiss theology and theology to dismiss science. It's a mistake for either of them to dismiss metaphysics and metaphysics dismissing them, right? He says there's no shortcut to truth. I think that's the larger theme here. It's like we need the best of our disciplines at play. Science does not answer all the questions. It raises metaphysical problems. It depends upon metaphysical presuppositions. It's the purpose of philosophy to point that out and let the scientists know, hang on, you're bringing a whole edifice, scaffolding to your data. And again, the purpose of the scientists is to say, hey, you're taking that imaginative generalization too far. We have to bring you back down to the data. The metaphysical method for Whitehead is that flight of the airplane, the ground, the sky, the ground, and on and on and on. That's how it works. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful analogy as well. On Friday, I had a wonderful colloquium with two professors, Lauren Ross and Megan Peters, both cognitive science or neuroscientists and philosopher from Irvine. And it was amazing because the topic we discussed was called "Why Science and Philosophy Need Each Other," and
Nice.
ultimately that was the main thing was to come out of this was that they need each other. It's this is something that is very mutually beneficial. It's a symbiotic relationship. They build upon each other, and what I find to be, particularly if I look at myself at 17, is that I had a caricature of these other thinkers in my head. As a scientist, you have a caricature of an anything goes sort of view of the other person, or as the philosopher looking at the scientist, it's almost this shut up and calculate caricature, and both are looking at each other in this very caricatured way. And that's a big problem. I mean,
Yeah.
overall, you need to realize there's so much detail and nuance behind people's views. So there's a layer of respect that sort of grows with it. And this project is one of those
Yeah.
things to sort of highlight these nuances.
Well, it absolutely is. And I mentioned sort of popular scientists earlier. Again, deGrasse Tyson and Hawking, and um, Harari himself is not a philosopher scientist per se, but what you see in all of them, unfortunately, despite their popularity, is saying philosophy is really not needed, right? Or Harari, like, value is just a story we tell ourselves. It has no connection really to the universe. It's such a pernicious perspective. And again, abstracting human experience as if though it tells us nothing about the wider world. DeGrasse Tyson does this all the time as well. So what this project will do, the Mind at Large project, in addition to critically exploring the various ways in which mind is returning, is to also offer our return, right? Our own continuity, our own belonging to this universe in the ways of meaning and value and purpose. And that's not insignificant, because as we know, the meaning crisis, as Vervaeke and many of his colleagues have promoted it, is linked to all many things. It has many layers. The biggest part would be belonging, I would argue, right? A sense of belonging to this universe. And belonging is where being and longing come together, right? And we need a worldview where that can happen. So I think, in addition to the theoretical, the empirical, scientific dimensions of the Mind at Large project, there's a meaning, there's an existential dimension. For me, that's quite important. That will definitely be a part of this as well. We belong to the universe, right? That's the gospel right there. That's the good news, right? And I think we can find good ways of expressing that. And mind helps, right? So we're going to take all that very, very seriously.
Andrew, in your forthcoming Whitehead's Universe, you aim to make process thought more accessible. How important is public philosophy for a paradigm shift like Mind at Large?
Awesome. It's extremely important. And one of the difficulties of process philosophy, process metaphysics, is its opaque language, right? So you've read some Whitehead, folks listening who've read Whitehead, is very difficult. So yes, my next book, hopefully coming out in the new year, is Whitehead's Universe, a Prismatic Introduction. And what that aims to do is really offer a comprehensive but conversational introduction to Whitehead for an audience of undergrads and early grads in philosophy, in science, and in religion. So I think public philosophy is extremely important, because let's remember, philosophy was originally a guide for living. Its ancient conception. It wasn't just about sitting in armchairs and thinking lofty thoughts. It was about the inculcation of wisdom. It was about the cultivation of wonder, even if that wonder is never quite satisfied. But that's the brilliant thing, right? So philosophy begins in wonder, Whitehead says, and in the end, when philosophic thought is at its best, the wonder remains. So whatever philosophy is, it's not about ridding ourselves of wonder. It's about its cultivation. And we need people wondering, not just in ivory towers. I mean, we need the wider culture. We need the young voices to feel free to wonder, feel free to find wisdom. And as Vervaeke rightly says, we're in a sort of wisdom famine. How do we get wisdom back? Well, there's only one discipline whose very meaning is the love of wisdom, right? Philosophia. So I think the public, turning the volume up at a public level on philosophy, on central questions, is essential. I think my new book, has been so much fun to write. I think it'll be the next go-to introduction to Whitehead. There's a few of them out there. I could be wrong, but I hope so. And it's been a love affair for me. And I've written it because I think people can benefit from Whitehead's vision. It allows them to fall in love with the universe again. And make no mistake, love is a part of this universe because it's a part of our experience. Again, making no big distinction between my experience and what the universe is doing. So,
well, I'm looking forward to that book. Can't wait to read it. Excited. If you any expected date, Andrew? Do you know at any point you're planning to try and get this out?
Yeah, I'll have to keep you updated. I am very close to signing a contract with Orbis Books, and so I hope as soon as I do that, it'll be on the mend here. Hopefully in the new year. But yeah, I'll have a date for you. I'll definitely send you a copy. I really think you're gonna enjoy it.
No, I'm super excited for it. But to get back to this Mind at Large project as well, Andrew, and link it up, how does your process philosophy handle things like free will and agency? in a cosmos of relational becoming? And how might this inform debates about things like AI and autonomy?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly the case that freedom remains um, on the attack. I mean, can I put it that way? I suppose from all sorts of philosophers. And again, this is where metaphysics becomes so important. In a world that is made of vacuous, dead matter that is only externally related, where agency in mind is vanquished, it's no wonder that people think we're in a determined cosmos, right? We look out, we see the motion of the planets, we see the regularities of things that seem to proceed with this deterministic dimension, and we read that back into our experience. We too must be utterly determined. Free will must be an illusion. Okay, this again is where Whitehead would say, hold on, you've just looked at nature from the outside in, you neglect to look at it from the inside out. I would argue our experience absolutely gives us data that we are able to, as agents, break the power of the past in novel ways. That's what freedom is, right? Efficient causality pushes on us to repeat, right, what was repeated in the past. But we have the ability to take what the past offers and do something novel with it. So self-determination in this regard, for Whitehead, happens at every level of reality. The past is heavy. It doesn't fully determine what the event chooses. So Whitehead remains convinced that there's a slice of self-determination, there's a slice of self-creativity that pervades nature, right? And like, why doesn't nature endlessly repeat itself? Like, why do novel things happen? This is a philosophical question Whitehead refused to take lightly, right? So there's possibilities of novelty, a part of the metaphysical structure, but then there's decisions, right? Which choose for some possibilities as opposed to others, which allow novelty to come in. And again, deciding an event, deciding an amoeba, deciding we're, again, stretching language here, we have to do that. But think of the Latin root, decidere, right, to cut off. Something is chosen and something negated, a new possibility is realized. So how does human creativity emerge in a universe that's purely determined? I think that's the sort of wrong question. We have to start with the inside and generalize outward. Okay, even the laws of nature for Whitehead are habitual patterns that have come into a certain reign, but will pass out eventually when our epoch passes out. They're not unchanging and ultimately necessary in a pure deterministic fashion. So this is where I think, there's a pragmatic principle, there's a pragmatic dimension to Whitehead's thinking. He says, we must bow to those presumptions which, in despite of criticism, we still employ for the regulation of our lives. Freedom is one of those presupposed notions. Deny it theoretically, have fun doing that. Try to live that out practically, you can't do it, right? So the practice of your life has to govern the theory and not the other way around. And when those are at odds with each other, Whitehead says there's negations of what in practice is presupposed. Practice determines metaphysical theory and not the other way around. So it's a long way of saying freedom belongs in the process universe as long as we are an expression of this universe. And, as to whether that can be extended again to the AI discussion, I'm not sure. I remain sort of open-minded about that, although skeptical. But imagine what would happen if we really believed we were fully determined. What are our courts of law for, right? All sorts of humanitarian crises would emerge if we really believed it. So my approach is that you cannot hold that we are determined consistently. It's theory which really overlooks practice when it should be the other way around.
Andrew, one of the things we mentioned earlier was that Whitehead was a mathematician. And I think an important question would be then, could mathematics or formal models play a role in clarifying the axiarchic or process relational vision of consciousness in the cosmos?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question. They could, I suppose, right? I don't know if I have so much to say in depth on this. Math is not my forte per se. I look at Whitehead's later work, right, not the earlier work. I think absolutely they could clarify, they could assist. I think one caution though that I would offer and that Whitehead would offer is to not mistake the abstract for the concrete, right? Peter mentioned this, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It's a beautiful fallacy. well, it's a terrible fallacy, but it's a beautiful way of naming it, right? That we mistake our mathematical often abstractions for the reality. So I think abstractions are tools, they're instruments of methodology, but we have to be quite careful to not reify them into the reality itself, right? So mathematical models continue to shed insight, but the world will always be more than mathematical models, right? And there's some philosophers say it's all just pure mathematics. Well, in a sense, but it's more than that too, you know. Anyway, but again, math is not my direct acquaintance per se.
The reason why I asked that is because it's a good way to show that this is still going to be useful within this project. So things like mathematics, everything we do, study, learn, etc., it all
Sure.
falls into this project. It's not a way to sort of isolate or move away from it. This is a very much interdisciplinary bringing together of different thoughts, and ultimately leads to one of the questions I want to ask you, which is, what do you see as the biggest barrier preventing mainstream academia from embracing a broader mind-infused ontology?
Yeah, great. I think the biggest barrier is a certain habitual bias against this whole idea, you know? Okay, but having said that, there is a lot of signs that the academy is shifting, right? I mean, think about it. Somebody like Philip Goff, his work, again, doing great work. I think he needs to, study process philosophy more. But his ideas are now seen as more mainstream. Or Galen Strawson or Christoph Koch. I mean, these are all folks who are pushing towards the panpsychist direction and are not losing their jobs because of it, right? Um, so there was a time when it was really anathema to see mind or sentience pervading things. This 20, 30 years ago, process thought always anticipated the panpsychist sort of renaissance. And I think what we're seeing in Goff and Koch and Strawson's work is an expression of that, right? We were calling for it. Again, not that it's a competition, but I just think that the academy, although it has this habitual bias, especially in philosophy departments, there's also signs that bias is not completely strong. I mean, there's holes in it, and so that's important. I think there's the fact of cultural change when it comes to ideas is a part of this as well. It's slow, right? Patience is required. Whitehead has a beautiful analogy in his first lecture at Harvard, 1924. He ends it saying, in a sense, philosophy does nothing, but pay attention and look closer, right? And just as the waves which slowly beat ashore seem to do nothing over long periods of time, shape whole continents of thought, right? So it's a beautiful analogy that change in the academy may happen fast with respect to these ideas, these debates. Change in the wider culture may take a few hundred years. We've taken a few hundred years to get to a place of really saying materialism is wrong. We've known that 100 years in the physics world, less so in the biological world, although that's changing. But the wider culture, I'd say, still has a default assumption of a mechanistic, materialistic world. And I just think that this project and, the kinds of writing that are involved in myself and my colleagues are trying to sway the culture, sway the academy towards these more animist and psychist, idealistic forms of proposals. They don't agree on everything, but they're the return of mind in a really strong, in a really interesting and creative and adventurous way. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. But the culture is lapsing behind the academy often.
Yeah, and I think it sort of shows also with not just the thinkers who have brought this up to the forefront for many years, who've been doing it, but also in the way certain thinkers have now treated it as well. Because you've got certain people like, as you said, Michael Levin's doing incredible work. And initially, while he never really openly said he was panpsychist or really approached it that way, you could sort of see the philosophy extending out of his work at this point. And now he talks about it a lot more openly, and the way his views have changed over time and how his work has changed his own views. You've got him writing papers with Daniel Dennett about cognition all the way down, and someone like Dennett to even write papers about something like that. I mean, it's not particularly in his illusionist framework's interest, I would say. But it's not to say that Dennett
Yeah,
became a panpsychist before dying, of course, but and rest in peace, Dan.
sure.
And then you've got someone
Yeah,
like Susan Blackmore who's written recently. I don't know if you know this, but I actually forgot to mention this to Peter because we spoke after Peter and I discussed the fact that him and Sue had a meeting coming up, and he had to meet her because they live quite close to each other. But Sue's now got
yeah,
a panpsychist of models. She sees consciousness a little bit differently at this point. Um, and it swings towards the panpsychist view, which is surprising. And I told Sue about this as well when we chatted about it. But she has a panpsychist of models all the way down, which I think everyone should check out. It's quite fascinating. But yeah, that's one of the things you can see, which is this
that,
view is a lot more accepted, a lot more discussed within the academic circle, and it's being a lot more respected ultimately.
yeah. Well, and just to add to that, and yeah, rest in peace, Dan. I thought it was interesting that you wrote your dissertation. I didn't know that about you on
Yeah.
illusionism, right?
Yeah.
As McGilchrist often says, well, there has to be something to be eluded, right? So what is it that's being eluded, right?
You look, I think
Oh,
illusionism, similar to panpsychism, when I used to look at panpsychism from an illusionist framework, I could tell how misunderstood panpsychist views were while trying to argue for illusionism. The same way I can
sure.
see the way an illusionist's views are very logical, coherent, but not everyone's. But I used to, when I look at the way Keith Frankish argues these points and I see the way he discusses certain concepts, I can see exactly how or why he he doesn't need to. I feel like there's no need to backtrack as much as they do because I sort of understand where he's coming from, and I find the same thing
Yeah,
happens to a lot of panpsychist thinkers where they're trying to backtrack certain things for the average materialist or the illusionist. And at this point, because of this podcast, I've managed to, because I tell people I create a model of the guest in my mind and try to embody that model throughout the entire couple of weeks leading up to it while reading their books. I think I've done that so much that I cannot claim to be an illusionist anymore because that has fundamentally changed over time. I can't claim to be a panpsychist either because I'm still exploring so many different concepts. It's not to say I'm a
yeah,
mysterious, but I am a lot more open-minded, that's for sure.
yeah. No, I think that's the right posture, right? Um, you know, but I'm glad you're not on the illusionist side. Again, I have good friends on the illusionist side too.
Yeah.
Um,
I
so,
think it's
but I
at this
just
point
wanted to pick up on
I'm
some.
agnostic
Yeah.
about the ontological status of the mind.
Okay. Okay. Well, I hope you won't stay in the agnosticism forever. I think with a channel like this, you're destined not to.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've
you know,
committed myself for life at this point.
for sure, for sure.
I mean,
You mentioned Michael
if
Levin.
there's no mind body problem, there cannot be a mind body solution. I guess I should end the show at that point if we've.
Exactly. And you don't want to do that. The
Yeah.
wonder has to remain. So, I just wanted to pick up though on the science philosophy relation again, because you mentioned several people there. And again, Michael Levin's work is fascinating. And we've had, done some work together. We had him at a conference. Actually, he was at our McGilchrist conference virtually. He's hard to get in person anywhere, I've realized. But here's somebody who is letting the empirical data govern his work. Absolutely. So he's very keen on saying that, okay, I'm not just thrusting philosophical concepts onto the data here. I'm letting the data speak and then, imaginatively generalizing what that means philosophically. So you're right. While he says he's not a out and out panpsychist, although maybe he has, it seems to be implied in what he's demonstrating. Moreover, he's recently promoted the reality of Platonic-like morphospaces, right? So here we are back to this Platonic-like question. And maybe your colleague George Ellis in South Africa there. Are you familiar with George Ellis?
I'm familiar
His
with
work?
Georges, but I haven't met him.
All right. Well, here's another, cosmologist, on Yurkon, and they're working, originally with Hawking, but somebody who's a fantastic scientist, but somebody who's unwilling to let go of the philosophical dimensions, right? Um, there's a lot to say about him. Just to alert you and some of your audience, in November we're going to have Levin and George Ellis in a moderated discussion for the Center for Process Studies, precisely on this question of possibility spaces, right? There's morphogenetic possibility spaces. For Ellis, there's ethical possibility spaces, right? Possibilities of states of value that could be, but are not yet, right? All those things were in the nature of things before we were. right? So again, we're being pushing back to ontology, pushing back to metaphysics, not in spite of, but because of the brilliance of our scientific advance, right? Again, just this theme of science and philosophy being tangled is such a fruitful one.
Yeah, no, I definitely see the appeal. And I must say, when it comes to, if I try not to give too much of my specific views on it, because I find that the show is a lot more about the guests. But yeah, in terms of the work that's being done by Michael, he's becoming, he's one of those people who, if there had to be someone who could like push me to that edge, he's definitely the one. I mean, his work is
Yeah,
incredible. And even the way he defends it online. If someone tweets him something that's, or X's him something, let's say, that about his views, he'll say, no, this is exactly what I'm trying to say is happening in the biology, and this is what it therefore means. It's not that he's just making
yeah,
these claims, as you just said. It's more about the work is literally dictating his view at this point, which I
yes,
think is
right.
pretty cool to see someone do such groundbreaking work and then it have so
Yeah.
many philosophical implications immediately after. It's so epic to watch.
And it really is. He's a very admirable, clear thinker. Um, to to hark back to the cultural discussion too, it's like, and the academy, they're going to need more than just philosophers telling them, right? They need to have the science be pushing the culture in that direction as well. So I think he's a wonderful example of that. There's others as well, but you know, science guides philosophy, philosophy guides science, theology, religion, if that's your thing, put it that way, over offers an overall context of meaning, right, for these endeavors, right? And I think all of them belong. And an adequate worldview, an adequate metaphysics, I think, is one that integrates our disciplines, which often are desperate, but finds a unified synthetic context in which to see the whole together in some way, and do so and communicate it in a way that's inspiring, that's adventurous. I mean, I'm inspired by philosophy. That's why I keep doing it. And this is why when I have two stepkids and they're in ever take a philosophy class or ever read my books, who knows? But if philosophy instructors are, deflated persons, if the wonder has left them, this is the failure of philosophy, you know? And I'll just say there's nothing in the scientific worldview that requires meaninglessness, this default perspective of sort of meaninglessness and nihilism. There's nothing in the science that requires that. That's a philosophical perspective brought to the data, but the data is more interesting than that. I absolutely believe that.
Yeah, I think we share a lot in common in that regard. I think that mind body solution is primarily. I try and make this clear to people as well because I'm a medical doctor. People assume when they hear the title, it's also something medical, but it's not. This is fundamentally about my love philosophy. This is a philosophical project. This is my ode to philosophy in a sense, particularly philosophy of mind at that point. But I
Yeah,
love it, man. This is just the best topic to explore. It's my favorite hobby. This brings me the most excitement, the most joy, and it's ultimately to inspire global inquiry in philosophical questions, in these fields that we love so much, beyond the philosophy as well, into the other realms of theology, science, whatever it might be, mathematics, etc. It's just a pure love and passion project. And on
yeah,
that note, I mean, one of the things you mentioned was, I mean, this academic bridge, bringing it together, trying to bring all of this together with film, media, conferences. Mind at Large, we're trying to do this via podcasts as well. Why do you think, Andrew, it's important for us as philosophers, as scientists, or just global thinkers in general? Why is it important for storytelling? How essential is storytelling when it comes to shifting the collective imagination about consciousness and
mhm,
reality?
yeah. Because arguments are not enough, right? You can give a bare deductive argument, that is characteristic of analytic philosophers. God love them. but things need embedded in a story. We need stories. Who was it? The American poet, Mariel Kaiser. The universe is not made of atoms, it's made of stories. Okay, that's a very processual uh, account, right? Stories go all the way down and all the way up, right? And stories are the most, arguably, historically, if you think about human species, the most important way of communicating deep and abiding truths and the importance of those truths. Think of, Christ in the parables, right? Of course, it need not be historically true that the story of the prodigal son, but we understand the moral ethos behind it. We want to also tell stories that are true literally as well. I think of Whitehead, who quoted Plato and say, what he's seeking in his metaphysics is the most likely story. So we have to embed what we're doing in a story, because the stories are the way in which we actually connect to phenomena in a deep sense. We don't do that through dry arguments. We have to use poetic dimensions. We have to use metaphor, even myth, right? These are not, again, the modern world looks at these things often and says myth is just something that's not true, or whatever, imagination is, it's just imaginary. This is not true. Or whatever metaphor is, right? It's the less than literal rather than the more than literal rendering of human language. Story is the context in which all those metaphor, myth, all those come alive in a deep and abiding sense. We think of cosmologists today, big history, right? That whole label of big history is a cosmological story. And like it or not, we're in a story. We haven't written it per se, right? But we're a part of it. And we have an important element of writing chapters in that narrative. And so I think the story of mind is our story, and I think we have to tell it in that way. It's not just our story, right? The story of mind is a part of a wider cosmic narrative that belongs to the universe itself. And so story is revealing. It's revealing of depths of value, depths of possibility. Story presents what we could be, but are not yet, and in that sense, they haunt us, right? That's what these parables do. They haunt us with moral achievement that we've not yet achieved. I think you can tell stories of ideals in science. You can do it in philosophy, right? And let's just remember that a lot of the scientific stories of achievement, of advance, from Einstein to others, these didn't happen just by bare data. They happened by imaginative leaps, by imagining what could be as to a story of the universe, right? But just think all that comes into play, man. And we are storied beings, and we're storytellers. We're narrative beings in a narrative cosmos. And I think there's better and worse ways to tell that story, and there's ways to get closer and further from the truth, right? Signaling Robert Kuhn, right? So story is fundamental, and we're going to tell a story about the rise and the fall of consciousness and its return, in the way in which we're protagonists, chiefly so.
Yeah, I think, and I can't wait to be part of it. I'm excited. I mean, it actually reminds me of something I wrote in my dissertation, even though it was at the time so different from my own views right now. But something I did write is that I am a process. I'm a part of this. I am a part of this universe, not apart from it. I'm a conscious conglomerate of cells designed by DNA, manufactured by molecules, organized by organelles, assembled by atoms, forged by fusion via stellar supernovae. We are fundamentally part of this. Beautiful alliterations. I loved it. It was one of my favorite things.
Oh, but I mean, you're telling a story right there,
Exactly.
and in a poetic way, right?
Thanks.
Yeah. So again, when we refuse to divorce ourselves from the universe, all sorts of things come back into play. Story is a part of this cosmos, right? It's like Dostoevsky every bit as much as the biblical narratives to the Upanishads. What does story reveal about what this universe is up to? And the most primal peoples, we told stories about the universe, creation stories. We're still telling those stories, right? This is not something we can run from. I think we should embrace it and try to better these stories,
Yeah, and I can't wait to tell more stories with you guys. This is going to be an exciting project. I think finally, to sort of round it all off, if the Mind at Large project succeeds, how might our future, how might our view of humanity's place in the cosmos look different in the next 10 to 20 years?
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. And I hope it does succeed. I mean, as Peter and Matt rightly suggested, we're not trying to change the world in a few conferences, but remember the ocean waves beating the continent, right? Things happen slowly. So I think in 10 to 20 years, I would hope that the ideas, many and diverse as they will be behind this project, will help shift our understanding of ourselves to a complementarity rather than a contradiction with this universe, right? We're not contradictory to it. If that were the case, we wouldn't exist, and we do, right? We are complements of this cosmos, and I really hope that the sense of belonging and continuity that comes along with that hits people at an existential level. This is the sort of pastoral dimension in me, right? In my work. You could do it philosophically, scientifically, all that's important. But I think for the wider masses, when we face ecological destruction, the meaning crisis, all these different crises, existential risk, right? All the ways in which we could render ourselves extinct, we need a new story of ourselves as continuous with this universe, as adventurers with it, not just as anomalies, you know? So I think we hope to advance the science and the philosophy. I hope in particular to advance the existential dimensions that are a part of this, right? There's a whole movement of philosophical counseling, right? It's been around since the early 80s, which uses philosophy as an alternative to a rampant therapy culture and says that by sitting with these ideas of the greatest thinkers, as complemented by other disciplines, we can actually revive the human spirit. And I think that's what we need. I'm strongly against the notion that human beings are just a negative and destructive force purely. That's a part of us. But metaphysics can cure misanthropy, and maybe that'll be a book title I'll have to write one day.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, are you familiar with the work done by Fulford at University of Oxford? Bill Fulford, University of Oxford.
I know the name.
Yeah,
I know the name, but you'll have to remind me.
It's called phenomenological psychopathology, and it touches on exactly what you're talking about right now: the integration of phenomenology within psychotherapy and treating patients. And another thing called values-based practice, which also ties in beautifully with your work. It's something you should definitely, if you're interested, check it out. But I agree with you. Everything you just said, completely beautiful. Your work is amazing. And Mind Body Solution myself, I'm excited to be part of it because ultimately the vision of Mind at Large is this inspiring global inquiry in these fields and to push this field forward in a more open-minded way, which I'm completely on board and super excited to be part of. So thank you so much for your work in this field, your work with Mind at Large, and I look forward to chatting to you in the future with many more about your work in a lot more detail. So yeah, thanks for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much. And yeah, we're very, very happy to have you along. It'll be great to connect in person, continue this discussion. So thanks, Tevin.
My pleasure, Andrew. Anything about the project in general, Andrew, you'd like to close off on? Any final words?
Just a reminder to everybody, the mindatlargeproject.com, or I think it's mindatlargeproject.com, not the. So we're going to be updating that website with all the details for the upcoming conference in University Exeter, scheduled for April. If you're interested in my work, andrewmdavis.info. I keep that updated with books, course opportunities, other things. The Whitehead's Universe book that I mentioned is a course that I offer starting on a rolling schedule in 2026. So if anybody out there is wanting to learn Whitehead and start with a text that I hope will hit the culture in an interesting way, you're able to do that. Just go to either my website or whiteheadsuniverse.com. That's another place where you can find information about that. Otherwise, let's think together and continue the Wondering Project. That's what this is all about in some deep sense.